Implicit or unconscious bias is one of the new tools that social justice types have acquired to bludgeon their enemies with. The common enemy, of course, usually being white people. Now, implicit bias is not new. The idea has been around for about 20 years, and you may have even taken an IAT or implicit association test. And I'll leave a link below if you'd like to try one. Basically, the IAT attempts to pick up biases and beliefs that people are either unaware of or that they know are socially undesirable, so they won't report them. And thus traditional methods like survey instruments or interviews can't pick them up. And the tests don't just examine unconscious attitudes towards different races. Tests have been developed for gender, sexuality, and other categories. And again, you can take a look down below for those types of tests. Now, one of the obvious problems here is that because implicit bias is by definition unconscious, you don't know that you're harboring these biases. So when you weaponize it, as social justice warriors have tried to do, you're essentially accusing people of thought crime. And remember, not even conscious thoughts, they're unconscious thoughts. Surely the real test of implicit bias is if it manifests in action, because if it doesn't manifest in behavior, then I personally couldn't care less what your unconscious biases are. Which brings me to this article which appeared a few days ago. 2 recent studies on implicit bias and microaggressions find opposite results of what SJWs predict.
Surprise, surprise, surprise!
Yeah, what a surprise. In a meta-analysis of change in implicit bias study that was conducted in May 2016 and recently covered by media outlets, researchers amalgamated evidence from 426 studies comprising over 72,000 participants to examine the effectiveness of different interventions for changing implicit bias. So here we're talking about implicit bias training to rid you of those thoughts and beliefs that you don't know you have. And the results from the abstract itself: finally, we found little evidence that changes in implicit bias mediate changes in explicit bias or behavior. Together, these findings suggest that implicit bias is malleable, but that changing implicit bias does not necessarily lead to changes in explicit bias or behavior. So whilst implicit bias could be changed, that is, participants would score differently on an implicit association test after an intervention, it doesn't change behavior, which I think most people would agree is more important. In fact, in one study, it was found that the training can have negative effects, validating individuals' biases and thereby perpetuating them. Quote, "The deleterious effects of stereotyping on individual and group outcomes have prompted a search for solutions. One approach has been to increase awareness of the prevalence of stereotyping in the hope of motivating individuals to resist natural inclinations. However, it could be that this strategy creates a norm for stereotyping, which paradoxically undermines desired effects. The present research demonstrates that individuals who received a high prevalence of stereotyping message expressed more stereotypes than those who received a low prevalence of stereotyping message or no message." So putting stereotypes in people's heads that didn't pay much attention to them to begin with leads them to pay more attention to them. Yeah, that wasn't predictable. And this is a great analogy to the problem with identity politics. The hyper-focusing on, for example, race issues leads you to see everything through that lens and ultimately open yourself to seeing race issues where there are none. But this is big business. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been committed to unconscious bias and diversity training more broadly by the likes of Facebook, Coca-Cola, Google, and even the CIA. So perhaps if it has no meaningful impact on behavior, then it's all fairly harmless, and for large corporations, it's just a cost of doing business. And they get to virtue signal to the echo chamber that they're keeping up with the progressive narrative. But as stated earlier, it's the campus SJWs that want to weaponize the concept of implicit bias to label people as some type of bigot. Have a listen to what I mean in this interaction between Ben Shapiro and a particularly obnoxious SJW.
Hi, Ben. So unconscious bias is a concept well documented in psychological studies, which is basically that people associate negative things with people of color and positive things with whites. So if that is true, how does it given that that is true, how does white privilege not exist?
Okay, so you're asking about unconscious bias. I apologize because it's kind of echoey, but the question was, if there is unconscious bias, just to repeat it so I'm making sure I get it right, if there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
The question is, given that there is unconscious bias, how does white privilege not exist?
So number one, so when I speak about white privilege, so when I speak about white privilege, I'm speaking specifically about behavior. Okay, there have been no studies, and really I've looked at these studies, the connection between what they call implicit bias, this is their favorite phrase now, implicit bias, unconscious bias, and biased behavior has yet to be proven at any level that is even remotely necessary to be used in, for example, a courtroom, which is why it's never been used in a courtroom. It is also true that there is no way, there really isn't, there's been no proven way to alleviate what they call unconscious bias, which means that we're ghost hunting. So what I would suggest is that if there is unconscious bias, and I'll acknowledge the possibility or the reality of unconscious bias, if there is, then I need you to I don't care about what's in people's heads so much as what they do. So if you point me to a racist behavior, don't worry, I'll let you respond. If you point me to a racist behavior, I'm happy to stand alongside you and protest it. What I can't do is protest about things in people's head that I don't know about because I'm not a mind reader.
Okay, so that's a really interesting response, and to that I have two questions. Firstly, what I've heard you say that this is something that, the way people think doesn't affect their behavior. So that's the first thing you've said. So I'm really curious if you can kind of give me another example of a thought that somebody has which doesn't affect their behavior. Like, do people who, support Trump not vote for him? Like, I'm very curious about that.
Yes.
And secondly, so the second thing that I want to ask is that if it's something it's hard to fix, does it mean we shouldn't do anything about it? Because you said, I don't know if we can change how people think. Does that mean we shouldn't try?
I mean, first of all, not a great impression. But beyond that, my voice isn't that low. But beyond that, as far as the first question, which is, do people have thoughts that don't manifest in behavior? Yes, all the time.
For instance,
every thought that you have about walking up here and strangling me right now. I assume like we have thoughts all the time that don't manifest in behavior, and this is true every single day. We consider thoughts that cross our minds. And the problem with unconscious bias is the idea is you don't even know that you're having the thought, right? So how can you stop it if you don't even know that you're having it? But then we should be able to gauge the unconscious bias and its impact on behavior. That's why it's unconscious bias as opposed to conscious bias. The idea behind unconscious bias is that it's not even a ghost, it's a ghost of a ghost, because you don't even know you're having the thought. So people, the whole idea behind diversity training is the idea that you can retrain people to stop their chain of thought in order so that it doesn't manifest in behavior. I don't think that every thought manifests in behavior. If it did, then every time a man saw a good-looking woman walk down the street, a straight man saw a good-looking woman down the street, we'd have a real mess on our hands. So the second question, the idea was a little too broad for me to respond to, which is, just because something is tough, don't we have to face up to it? Yes, we have to face up to tough things all the time. And one of the tough things I would suggest that we face up to is that you have a lot more control over your own behavior and the decisions you make than the supposedly widespread unconscious bias of people you've never met.
Now, that's probably one of the best examples of how to deal with and neutralise an insufferable SJW bigot, particularly on this topic. And of course, if you can find specific cases or incidences of racism, most people have no problem in calling it out. But as Shapiro notes, with implicit bias, you're just ghost hunting a ghost. And Sam Harris also dealt with this briefly on his podcast last August in a discussion with Glenn Lowry.
I think we have to distinguish between the mere harboring of certain biases and a commitment to enshrining those biases or a sense that those biases are good or something that shouldn't be corrected for. And so, so racism can't merely be a matter of harboring certain biases, because it can't be that you fail to be perfectly neutral on an implicit association test. Because if that's the standard, almost no one will escape hanging. Even many black people will be convicted of racism against blacks.
And I think that Mahzarin Banaji, the psychologist at Harvard, who was one of the founders of the implicit bias literature, would agree with that. I don't think she would claim an equivalency between implicit bias as measured by one of her tests and racism.
And I'll link to the full podcast below. So if you do take one of these tests and you find that you have implicit bias, then you shouldn't freak out that you're a closet racist. And as Glenn Lowry suggests, even the creators of the test wouldn't make that claim. But it does speak to a larger problem, namely that it is often not those that come up with such concepts that are the problem. It's the people who appropriate them for their own nefarious ends. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, or consider throwing me $1 on Patreon. See you next time.